One of the biggest problems with talking about the growth or decline of the video game industry and its audience is that it almost doesn't matter what kind of stance you take, you'll be lumped with one extreme or another by intentional misunderstandings. Somehow the topic short-circuits people, journalists and reviewers included. So let me make some bold statements that are sure to be misrepresented by both extremes on the matter. The gaming audience is not growing. Perception of it is. And I think it has to do with the audience growing up with video games when they were younger being adults now, normalizing the act of playing video games. Mobile is actually not cutting into consoles as aggressively as is always reported. Instead, they cut into browser games. This doesn't rule out that potential future growth is being cut away from home systems, as it means potential audiences go for mobile instead. This also paints a really weird picture for the future, as the current format of video games might directly be tied into the generations that were young with the NES to the GameCube eras, with later generations not really drawing in as many kids as they used to. If I'd have to go full pessimist, this is the worst kind of side effect from forcing the media to grow up along with you. I've expressed similar views around people deeply into video games, and a lot of them were incredibly dismissive to a point of suggesting that I've never seen any data or the numbers that they are aware of without expanding on what this data is or why they feel this way. Funny enough, after looking around more deeply into available sales data and marketing trends myself, I get a strong sense that the dismissal comes from a nerve being touched, a subject rather not faced directly because it's uncomfortable. Because it's uncomfortable to actually think about this or look into it. I mean, there has to be a real reason why news sites keep publishing articles about game development costs skyrocketing and it becoming impossible to be profitable at the current price points. Even though if you look into the game developmental costs and the sales numbers, all signs are actually pointing to no spike in money spent, but a constantly rising revenue stream. Mr. Phil made a video talking about how the gaming audience isn't growing as much as it should because gaming is prohibitively expensive, and I largely agree with his thoughts as well. I'll link his video in the description. First off, mobile is definitely growing, rapidly even. But a very large portion of the audience for mobile previously bought systems like the Wii for Wii Sports or the DS for brain training without bothering to explore the rest as much. Remember the Wii's insane sales numbers to a crowd who then never bought games? Remember how this was the big marker of a casual gamer? Remember how this was the big problem? Then remember how shortly after this, the problem was Zynga with Farmville on Facebook, and then it became Candy Crush on mobile. This audience has always existed, and is always treated as an entirely new group each time they show up. I'll say one thing for the mobile market though. Free-to-play microtransaction-filled video games were never so close to what you actually use to make purchases, and the most minimum of barriers in the way of a purchase will stop people from making bad decisions like these. The ease of purchase is what these games are actually thriving from. Also, a lot of people installing these games actually never make a purchase, even though the point of these games is all about making that conversion. The install base will still get used in the data about the growth of the industry without contributing to sales. One of the biggest problems with the discussion of the gaming audience growing or shrinking is always where the identity of the gaming audience begins or ends. You could argue the mobile market isn't into video games, that the people who used to buy a Wii for Wii Fit aren't actually gamers, and I don't think you're actually wrong in this inclusion from a demographic perspective either. None of these are really new changes, and they're fairly normal for any form of media, where a core thing has a different audience than the one at large. There's also the argument to be made that almost every time we're talking about this exclusion of people going for these titles, we're doing it in order to have a discussion about the audience for the games that we are interested in. The ones that are for our demographic. The same ones that are usually put first whenever anyone talks about the expanding appeal of video games. There's this weird unspoken rule where we aren't allowed to differentiate between the different demographics within media while bringing up the appeal of the games that appeal to one or two demographics in general. They might be larger demographics within the same core audience, but that's what larger AAA studios are shooting for. But it feels jarring to always have this association between the numbers that include everyone playing all sorts of games, even the throwaway phone games at work, with EA's big first-person shooter. I get the feeling part of the association is a forced marketing move to push more sales by misrepresenting these numbers and making people believe everyone is into them. When you look at movies, the biggest budget mass-marketed movies, like the Cape Shit movies from Marvel and DC that appeal to the largest audience out there, that would be mobile games with in-app purchases when we're talking about the largest pool of audience out there in video games. I know this statement sounds jarring because how gaming audience and demographics are usually framed, where the larger audience is on mobile games and then the true gamers are at the AAA, while the cult classics would be games like what Platinum or Falcom makes, the small indie developers tend to make. These would be the art house movies of games. Which is hilarious because the art games are usually the walking simulators, and the people who make those have huge disdain for the kind of games that the true gamers, the hardcore crowd that goes for the more in-depth titles, go for. Speaking of comparisons to the movie industry, you know what's really helping this grow of free-to-play microtransaction mobile game style? It's China. Like seriously, China has over double the amount of cell phone users compared to the US, and they have the fastest rising superstar company in the industry right now with a 40% growth at the top of the chain. You know what they also have? They don't have consoles, until recently. Like the first console that they got was the Xbox One, and they recently got the Switch, and that's about it as far as console culture goes. None of this information means that gaming is growing exponentially in the way that it's usually represented, that the entire pool of core gamers is increasing with the ambitious AAA developers leading the charge. So what about the counter to this, the doomsaying, that the industry is dying due to a lack of growth and that the crash is coming soon? I don't think either extreme is really true. Yeah, the gaming industry is growing and the core audience isn't really. But if anything, the real growth was the generations before it, normalizing playing video games to kids while they were young to a point that stayed normal in adulthood. In the meantime, there's also a lot more smaller scale in-depth games that don't fit either the AAA console or the mobile molds. Games that can play on older hardware priced lower that won't make a big dent on larger sales figures the way it's usually expected. Those exist in a larger volume than ever, and occasionally a few pop up and they catch everyone's attention. There is a growth in the amount of people playing, but they're very much splintered across smaller games more than ever, and a lot of that data tends to not get tracked because all the numbers tend to come from looking at major publishers. The thing that actually really bothers me about all of this is the tendency of the gaming media to act like if it isn't AAA, then it doesn't matter. I think the most recent example of the glorification of everything needing to be AAA is the coverage of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, with a few outlets jumping the gun on calling it proof indies can function like a AAA company before the game even turned an actual profit, and the floodgates opening once it finally had. It ended up making one in the end, but it always seemed odd how the only mention of the game after release had been about whether or not it shows that an indie game can function like a real video game. I get the feeling a lot of indie devs are going to overreach and kill their company attempting to follow in Ninja Theory's footsteps, likely with the help of a publisher looking at them as an expendable resource. Because let's be honest, AAA development per individual game title as a single purchase is generally not viable outside of very few exceptions. A lot of the time, articles will defend the current state of game development by explaining to us how video games are made from the ground up and how hard it is for publishers to keep selling these titles at their price point the way they are. And while that's not entirely untrue, it's also a bold-faced lie to suggest that every video game was built from the ground up with a single price point being attached to them. Annualization of franchises was a good way to keep the cost down, as a lot of the character models, animations, game systems are already in place for a focus on making more similar content at the same price point. Half of a development cycle for the same price, not counting revenue from special editions, DLCs, and possible microtransactions along the way. I mean, looking at Konami's attempt to push its franchises into AAA should say enough about that. They tried chasing the God of War money with Castlevania and fell flat on their face with multiple attempts. Then they threw out the low budget but well-performing handheld Castlevanias and tried replacing it with the God of War style brand. Right now, Castlevania doesn't exist anymore, outside of Netflix. Metal Gear Solid 5's assets are currently being reused to put together a game that you'd usually see on Steam with an early access tag. And the reason that developers aren't just raising the price point astronomically the way that both Bobby Kotick and the recent EA analysts suggest that they should, because games are already prohibitively expensive. Oh, and they actually tried to do this before. They called it a season pass. Part of why browser games took off and why mobile games are taking off is not just a point of ease of access, it's because it's a more affordable option. Consoles used to serve this purpose years ago before technology moved on and made it normal for everyone to have a system more affordable than most household PCs of those days. A lot of that need has eroded with where technology is now, though that doesn't mean everything is going to crash and burn. There is a large enough audience pool into the bigger games to keep making them for a long time to come. Maybe not in the current form that things are going, but games have always changed heavily every 5 years. We only just came out of the age of annualization of everything possible and entered into the age of gaming as a platform. But before that, we had the age of we finally figured out 3D, which had followed the age of hey look, we're totally 3D. I'm actually surprised that nobody else has really worked games as a platform into the model that Sega chose for Project Diva Future Tone, where the engine and 2 songs are free, and the actual content, the service you're paying for, is 2 massive song packs. StarCraft 2 nearly went for something like that when it went free to play. If they'd just gone, here's the game engine with its features, you can buy 3 fully fleshed out campaigns if you like the basis. What they did was close, but it's not entirely that. I think it's a good thing that we've diversified our genres and pools of interest for a smaller game venture to be sustainable, both through indies, but also thanks to the efforts of a lot of Japanese developers who don't quite hit that AAA budget the West is always shooting for. They're the actual new middle tier, even though that shouldn't exist anymore since the death of THQ, according to, the larger parts of games media, but because it's those groups, essentially, who can keep gaming both interesting, but also growing, with the way they can handle risk of trying new things while releasing at a lower price for lower end platforms. Anyway, these are just my thoughts, these are just my observations. I actually did do research. Last time I actually talked about it was in a Discord with a fairly large YouTuber who immediately dismissed me, saying that I can't have these opinions if I actually looked at any of the numbers or any of the market data out there. And actually, since doing it, my beliefs have become stronger. Yeah, I am growing stronger now. So yeah, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see ya.